In this session, we're going to set up a brand new Raspberry Pi Pico. This device has never been used before, so before we can use it, there is a bit of a setup that we need to do. To do this setup, we're going to need the Raspberry Pi Pico H. We're going to need a data cable, which we can plug into the Pico and to the computer. And on our Pico, we're going to need Thorny. You'll notice that on your Raspberry Pi Pico H, or whichever version of the Raspberry Pi you have, there is that white button and it's labeled boot cell. That button is what's going to allow us to set up our firmware on this device. To get started, I'm going to connect the USB cable to the Raspberry Pi Pico H. And this end of the cable is going to go into the computer. But before I plug it in, I'm going to press and hold down the boot cell button. And then while I'm holding that down, I'm going to plug this into the computer. You'll notice that the moment I plug it in, it appears as a memory storage device. At that point, I can release the button. I'll ignore the File Explorer window and I'll go straight to Thorny. In Thorny, we're going to go to that pop-up in the bottom right. And we have two options. We can install MicroPython or we can install CircuitPython. For our purposes, we're going to use MicroPython to code and to set up the Raspberry Pi Pico H. So at this point, I will install MicroPython. The moment you select install MicroPython or CircuitPython, whichever the case may be, a pop-up will appear. Once that pop-up has appeared, it will show you the device which is connected, which in this case is the RPi-RP2. Once that device has appeared there, it will populate the variants that you can install, as well as the version. Notice it says downloading version info or variant information. This may take some time. So let it populate the variant information, and once it's populated, you can then select the correct version to install on your device. So we'll give it a few moments to populate that information, and once all of that information has been populated, we will then be able to install it onto our Pico H. You can see now that it has indicated that 36 variants are available. So I'm going to select the variant that we desire. In this case, we're looking for the Raspberry Pi Pico H, which is that first one there. And which version do we want? Here it's giving us two versions. Obviously, the newer version is the 1.21.0, and I will click install. And you can see it started the process of copying the firmware to the device. It's completed that process. In the event that this process fails, there is an alternative process that you can do to install the firmware manually. To do that, you need to click this link here, which is going to go to our downloads for our firmware. This is the firmware that we need to install on that device, and you can see it shows this as the latest firmware. So I'm going to right click and save that, and I'll save it to the desktop. How we're going to use that is, if you recall when I connected the Raspberry Pi to the computer, a File Explorer window opened up. If you fail to install the firmware automatically through Thorny, open that File Explorer window, which is now closed on my computer, and go to your download, which is on desktop, and simply transfer that download into your Explorer window for the Raspberry Pi. As it's copying, before it comes to an end, that window is going to close. The closing of that Explorer window means that your Raspberry Pi Pico H has successfully been set up. At this point, we are able to go back to Thorny, close it, and we can unplug our Raspberry Pi Pico H. Now your Raspberry Pi Pico H is configured for programming. So this time when you plug in your Raspberry Pi Pico H to the computer and you come to the pop-up menu there, you'll notice that it no longer says install, but now it shows us our device. Your Raspberry Pi Pico H, or whichever version of Raspberry Pi Pico you have, is going to appear as the Raspberry Pi Pico or as the RP2040. The RP2040 is the chip that runs on the Raspberry Pi Pico. You can select either one of these options to write your code and run your code.